Ralph McInerny is a professor of philosophy and currently serves as the director of the Jacques Maritain Center at Notre Dame. This year, he enters his 50th year teaching at the university. He is the author of 24 scholarly books and many more scholarly essays. He is expert in the work of Thomas Aquinas, Soren Kierkegaard, and Jacques Maritain. He has written and lectured extensively on ethics, the philosophy of religion, and medieval philosophy. McInerny is editor of an acclaimed series of translations of Aquinas' commentaries, and for many years he directed Notre Dame's prestigious Medieval Institute. In his spare time, he founded, edited, and wrote for Crisis, a journal of lay Catholic opinion, and penned over 50 novels, including the well-known Father Dowling mystery series. He appeared on William Buckley's Firing Line and National Public Radio, and has lectured in 9 countries spanning 3 continents. He has served as president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, the Metaphysical Society, the American Maritain Society, and the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. He is a fellow of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. He was recently appointed to the membership of President Bush's Committee on Arts and Humanities. Professor McInerny is a valued friend of the Center and has spoken at many past events, including the inaugural lecture of this Catholic Literature Lecture Series, J.K. Chesterton Returns to Notre Dame, in November of 2002. It is always a pleasure to have him join us. Please join me in welcoming the speaker tonight, Ralph McInerny.
Thank you, Kate. Sounds like an obituary rather than an introduction. The title that appeared for this talk probably didn't make much sense to you. You might wonder if I know how to pronounce Evelyn Waugh's name. Perhaps a better rendition of it would be, it should rhyme with laugh, humor in Waugh. Waugh lived from 1903 to 1966, and he once began a book review by saying, there are 3 kinds of writer. There are those who know how to write and have nothing to say. There are those who have something to say and don't know how to write. And the rest are at meetings talking about the agony of creation. Well, Waugh himself knew how to write. He had something to say and seems never to have indulged in the usual self-pity of the creative writer. Before he found his way as a writer, he dabbled in the graphic arts. The illustrations in Black Mischief, for example, are by the author, and in cabinet making. His first novel, Decline and Fall, appeared in 1928, and already displayed a mastery of his craft that is unusual at the outset of a literary career. From that point on, with few exceptions, his novels are models of the art that conceals itself, like well-made cabinets. A careful study of them could save the aspiring writer a good deal of the agony of creation. But the initial reaction to most of his novels is laughter. They are funny, hilariously funny. Humor, one sometimes thinks, is the best medium for seriousness. From the very first novel, the reader finds, as the laughter dies, a residue of usually unstated or understated gravitas. For all that, readers of Decline and Fall and Vile Bodies, which appeared in 1930, those who ran as they read, could have been forgiven if they thought of him as merely a comic writer. P.G. Wodehouse, whose writing Waugh, like Belloc, held in high esteem, was the object of close study. Jeeves and Smith, the Golf series, the Mulliner stories, the whole Wodehouse canon provides hours of shrieking pleasure for the reader. Now, it's a truism that the explained joke is not the joke. There is a vast and humorless library on the nature of humor. To Woodhouse can easily be applied Oscar Wilde's dictum that we laugh but we are not wounded. We find in Waugh's journalism and reviews his appreciation of Woodhouse. The world of Woodhouse seems self-contained. The Drones Club is unlike any real club. Woodhouse's limp young men do not find their counterparts among the living. The stories run on issues of consummate triviality. The pursuit of a young woman is on a par with the pursuit of a lost golf ball, but no Woodhouse golfer would be permitted on any respectable course. Waugh's 1939 essay on the work of Woodhouse is called An Angelic Doctor. He had received an honorary degree from Oxford. It is clear that Waugh was a close student of this comic master, and what he has to say of him casts indirect light on himself. Woodhouse's characters, Waugh asserts, are purely and essentially literary characters. And he writes, "We do not concern ourselves with the economic implications of their position. We are a bit skeptical about their quite astonishing celibacy. We do not expect them to grow any older, like the Three Musketeers or the Forsytes. We are not interested in how they would react to changing social conditions, as publishers' blurbs invite us to be interested in other sagas. They are untroubled by wars." But literary or not, the world of Woodhouse is entered from this one, and it is to this one that we return. Even to say that it is essentially literary suggests a contrast. Of course, there is contrast within the stories, as well, particularly those introduced by the oldest member or by Mr. Mulliner, making them stories within stories. The comic requires a contrast, if only with the prosaic, and the literary, in Waugh's sense, implies the literal. For all that, we emerge from the world of Woodhouse with little sense that we are meant to see this one very differently. Another author whom Waugh obviously studied closely was the elusive and epicene Ronald Furbank, a fin de siècle fop and Catholic convert who was a minimalist in fiction before the term. The characters are fantastic, the plot's improbable, there are pages of nothing but dialogue, as we often find in Waugh. Moreover, in Furbank, elusiveness is all. In writing of him, Waugh notes that the way apparent asides scattered through a story connect and tell a little story of their own, one only a careful reader will find. This was a lesson Waugh himself learned well. For example, in Decline and Fall, the starting gun, fired at the ground as a safety precaution, nicks the foot of one of the boys about to race. His condition is casually alluded to later, until we finally learn, offhandedly, that his foot has been amputated. Another example, in Vile Bodies, Adam places a 1,000-pound bet on India Runner, a long shot, with a scarcely known colonel. Later, we learn that the horse has won, and from time to time the colonel appears on the margins of the action, fails to recognize Adam, but when he does, promises him his winnings. This weaves through the novel until, when the money is paid, it is worthless. Another example, the way Basil Seal becomes Minister of Modernization in Azania in Black Mischief. These are marvels of oblique narrative. If Woodhouse and Furbank are enormously important influences on Waugh, two others that would have to be mentioned are Belloc and Hemingway, both of them for their masterly use of language. Of course, it was Woodhouse's pellucid prose that Belloc praised. And when Waugh wrote of Across the River and Into the Trees, Hemingway's novel, he reviewed the book's reviewers. It was panned pretty universally, asserting that however inferior Hemingway, this book was infinitely better than those such reviewers customarily praise. It's perhaps an exaggeration, but I don't think there is a single lazy or uninteresting sentence in the whole of Waugh. He is an artist whose medium is the English language, but the language is the medium, not the message. It's impossible not to admire Waugh's style early in life, but this is always step two, reflexive, not the first reaction of the reader. On the first reading, the prose is all but transparent. A superficial reading of Waugh would see him beginning as a frothy Woodhouseian and then metamorphosing into the elegiac with Brideshead Revisited, ending with the underestimated, sometimes even by himself, war trilogy published over a decade from 1952 to 1961 and brought together as Sword of Honor. In a preface to the first gathering of these three novels, a preface missing from the recent modern library reprint, which is marred by the windy introduction of Frank Kermode, Waugh has this to say. On reading the book, I realized that I had done something quite outside my original intention. I had written an obituary of the Roman Catholic Church in England as it had existed for many centuries. All the rights and most of the opinions here described are already obsolete. When I wrote Brideshead Revisited, I was consciously writing an obituary of the doomed English upper class. It never occurred to me, writing Sword of Honor, that the Church was susceptible to change. I was wrong, and I have seen a superficial revolution in what then seemed permanent. Despite the faith of many of the characters, Sword of Honor was not specifically a religious book. Recent developments have made it, in fact, a document of Catholic usage of my youth. Well, was there an evolution in Waugh from one of the bright young people to grumpy old man? His mordant comments on modernity and on the ravages socialism wrought on his country have provided text for writer after writer who would dismiss him as one who dearly loved the Lord, a would-be aristocrat, a man who never voted because, in his own words, he did not presume to instruct his sovereign on her choice of ministers. Not for the first time in Scott King's Modern Europe, which concludes with the hero's judgment that it would be immoral to prepare a boy to live in the modern world, Waugh's distaste for post-war Britain is palpable. He once said that the only way he could remain in England was to think of himself as a tourist there. The contempt and hatred in which he is held by many leftist critics and journalists will one day be studied for the phenomenon it is. The present antidote to it is to go back to the early novels. The judgment that came as an odious surprise to many as the aging Waugh took on the persona of a curmudgeon is there from the beginning, and its vehicle is humor. Paul Pennyfeather, the protagonist of Decline and Fall, is a remarkably passive character. Unjustly expelled from his college for indecent behavior, when a mob of drunken students strip him to his shorts and run him through the quad, Paul, almost without demur, leaves and takes a position at a parody of a public school in Wales, where once again he is buffeted by people and events, emerging as the wooer of the mother of one of his students. She has inherited from a previous husband a brothel business, and when, on the eve of the wedding, Paul goes to Marseille, all unwittingly, to see off a new supply of girls for the Latin American trade, he is arrested, sent back to England, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. At the end of the novel, he is back at Oxford reading theology. As naive as Candide, Paul's vicissitudes are told with a lightness seldom darkened by any adverse comments, certainly on his part. He is surrounded by frauds, con men, heedless hedonists, amoral if not immoral colleagues and aristocrats, and is victimized by them all. He endures this with stoic equanimity. The reader laughs his way through the pages, and when the laughter dies, becomes aware that with authorial aloofness, Waugh has provided a foil against which to assess the events of the story. We could not laugh if we did not form the judgments of others that Paul himself eschewed. When we leave him preparing for the ministry, we realize what that foil is. Between his first and second novels, Waugh entered the Catholic Church. Who reading Vile Bodies would guess that its author had undergone a religious conversion? Of course, there is Father Rothschild in the novel, but the dramatis personae is made up largely of bright young people, and characters are introduced who will have a long career in subsequent novels. We are in post-World War I London, but the bright young people are too young to be veterans of that war. Their lives are made up of parties, drinking benches, affairs. Aristocrats are either bumbling fools or mindless hedonists. But it is the all but submerged point of view that gives meaning to these antics. It would be excessive to compare Waugh with Dante, but there seems little doubt that we are in hell. It is the world in which Waugh's first marriage, to the other Evelyn, as he called her, took place. His wife's infidelity scarred Waugh indelibly, and versions of what happened show up in other novels, not least in Handful of Dust in 1934, whose very title provides the viewpoint of the novel. These lines from Eliot's The Wasteland are quoted on the title page. I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Eliot, of course, shared Waugh's estimate of the modern world, and, like him, sought refuge from it in Christian faith. The way in which faith influences the Catholic writer is a subject, of course, of great complexity. Perhaps Catholic fiction could be compared with the analogous phenomenon of Christian philosophy. For some Catholic writers, religious dogma becomes thematic in the story, sometimes quite overtly, as in Graham Greene's Catholic novels, sometimes obliquely via clerical characters, as in J.F. Powers, but sometimes only as the ambience providing the author's point of view, as in Flannery O'Connor. Waugh's early work shares the subtlety of the presence of faith that we find in, for example, Walker Percy's Thanatos Syndrome. The presumably secularized reader has his outlook accepted as good money and then is led to see the bankruptcy to which it leads. The believer, by contrast, is portrayed as a madman, as indeed he is, in contrast with modernity. He is a scandal and a folly. Handful of Dust may be Waugh's darkest novel, proceeding inexorably toward disaster, and the finale, in which Tony Last, the prisoner of Mr. Todd in a Latin American jungle, is condemned to read the works of Dickens over and over to his illiterate captor. Waugh disliked Dickens, as the reader of Donat Gallagher's Penguin collection of Waugh's essays, articles, and reviews will know. Brenda, Tony's wife, bored with their life in a crumbling country house, Hetton Abbey, meets the vacuous John Beaver, takes an apartment in town, and then drifts without difficulty into adultery. In one of the most horrible scenes in Waugh, when Brenda learns in London that her son John has been killed, she thinks at first that John Beaver is meant. Learning the truth, she says, thank God. Tony is devastated by what has happened to his marriage, and in a familiar move in Waugh's fiction, heads for foreign lands where worse disasters await him. The story is told with no overt moralizing, either by author or characters. The banality of evil is allowed to display itself without comment. Bright chatter, wit, people who lack all seriousness dominate the scene and are put before us with marvelous pith and accuracy. It is as if Waugh expects his reader to supply the criteria of judgment on the antics of the novel. It is in Black Mischief of 1932 and Scoop of 1938 that the present-day reader may find his politically correct assumptions most assaulted. Of course, already in the first novel, as in the hilarious description of the arrival of town musicians, the Lanaba Silver Band, for the school game day, Waugh's English condescension is on display. This is the description of the arrival of that band. 10 men of revolting appearance were approaching from the drive. They were low of brow, crafty of eye, and crooked of limb. They advanced huddled together with the loping tread of wolves, peering about them furtively as they came, as though in constant terror of ambush. They slavered at their mouths, which hung loosely over their receding chins, while each clutched under his ape-like arm a burden of curious and unaccountable shape. On seeing the doctor, they halted and edged back, those behind squinting and molting over their companion's shoulders. Huh? No wonder the Welsh want independence. Huh? In Black Mischief, Seth, the emperor of Azania, is an absurd figure, and doubtless throughout the novel there is condescension towards natives, towards blacks, towards Indians, towards the mix, as well as any non-English. But the emperor's absurdity stems from his efforts to bring progress and the new age to his realm with the help of the redoubtable Basil Seal. The target of the satire is not the little empire, but the European ways Seth seeks to impose upon his people. The birth control pageant is one of the great set pieces of the novel, rivaled only by Dame Mildred Porch and her companion, Miss Sarah Tenn, who have been drawn to the empire out of compassion for animals and find themselves lauded for their refined cruelty to animals. The British embassy is not spared. Sir Sampson Courtenay is a diplomat who does not let business interfere with his knitting and begrudges hospitality to his visiting countrymen. His promiscuous daughter, Prudence, is writing Panorama of Life, has an affair with Basil, and when revolution breaks out and she is flown away, her plane makes a forced landing. Sometime later, Basil, replete from feasting with a backwoods tribe, learns that Prudence has been the meal. Writing in the novel in 1962, Waugh admits that a reader might mistake Azania for Abyssinia, but denies any similarity, as he should, between Seth and Haile Selassie. In Scoop, Waugh combines his contempt for journalism and Africa, but this is a light novel, beginning with a comic cliche, mistaken identity, and unraveling the delightful consequences. John Boot is no Basil Seal, and his adventures are less laden with implicit critiques of the colonizing countries. Perhaps Waugh's last truly comic novel, recalling his earliest manner, is Put Out More Flags, which appeared in 1942. It's set at the time of the phony war, the long period after war was declared and before true movements on the part of the Germans began. It ended when Hitler swept through France and ended up 25 miles away across the Channel. In the novel, Basil Seal, Lady Metroland, Ambrose, Silk, Peter Passmaster, and other characters from early novels romp through the story. It is a hilarious send-up of the preparations for combat, men jockeying for position. Basil says that he wants to be one of those hard-nosed men who made a good thing out of the war. Huh? It is as if Waugh is bidding adieu to them all, though, allowing them a final fling before the real awfulness begins. But one finds two adumbrations of both Brideshead and the War trilogy, the trying out in a comic key of themes which will later be elegiac. With this notable exception, put up more flags, it could be said that Waugh's moral center of gravity, what makes his humor more than funny in a Woodhouseian way, is less and less implicit in later novels. The prologue and the epilogue of Brideshead Revisited present Charles Ryder in the Army, his unit billeted on the massive estate of the Marchmain. The contrast with the events of the novel and this frame provides the lens through which we see the remembered events of Ryder's association with the Marchmain, a golden world, suffused with nostalgia. It stands in bleak contrast to a present in which the age of the gentleman is fading away, the world of Hooper. There is snobbery here, no doubt of it, but if that were all, the novel could not continue to command the readers it does. Doubtless many saw the television series based on the novel before they read it, if they ever did, and that's not all bad. Waugh has been well served, I think, when novels of his have been turned into films. The adaptation of Handful of Dust relentlessly conveys the dark viewpoint of the novel. Scoop was an easier matter, of course, and the results are on the same level of comedy as the novel itself. The Loved One appeared in 1948, a slight and delightful novel that has great fun with Hollywood and Forest Lawn Cemetery. The preparation of the corpse for viewing, the trivialization of death by Baroque obsequies, the smoke lifting from the crematorium, these make for easy comedy, and Waugh, at the height of his narrative powers, immortalizes them in a sense that even Mr. Joyboy might have understood. After the war, Waugh became a character, a kind of Colonel Blimp, who provided endless copy for journalists, goading them into excess and then successfully suing them. His manner of life enraged those of a leveling outlook. His country house, his aloofness, alleviated only by infrequent television appearances in which he fulfilled all the horrified expectations of his interviewers. But he did not wholly enjoy his alienation. There was a kind of nervous breakdown on which he based The Ordeal of Gilbert Penfold of 1957. The outlook of the protagonist is captured neatly. There was a phrase in the 30s, "It is later than you think," which was designed to cause uneasiness. It was never later than Mr. Penfold thought. Think about it. This most autobiographical of his novels invites identification of author and protagonist. Penfold is a writer. He's described that he regarded his books as objects which he had made, things quite external to himself, to be used and judged by others. He thought them well made, better than many reputed works of genius, but he was not vain of his accomplishment, still less of his reputation. It is a novel one reads differently than any other by Waugh, I think. The author himself has become the target of his comic genius. It interrupted the production of Waugh's masterpiece, but one comes to think that Penfold was worth the delay. Great things take time, Newman said. The three novels that make up The Sword of Honor appeared over almost a decade, separated by great intervals. Anthony Pole's A Dance to the Music of Time comprises 12 novels and covers a far greater period of time than the trilogy. So a comparison of the two achievements must inevitably seem strained. Pole's vast cast of characters meet and meet again, usually in the most adventitious way, and the narrative advances sinuously. Like Waugh, Pole has been the object of ridicule by some leftist critics, usually for all the wrong reasons. Waugh himself reviewed Casanova's Chinese restaurant, and it may seem surprising to find him there chiding his friend on the way his characters view marriage. But this turns out, I think, to be an internal, not external criticism. Waugh wrote this: Mr. Pohl's characters are married and fretting under the restraints and disillusions of their state. What one is not told and needs to know in order to understand them is what they mean by marriage. None of them avows any religious belief or traditional ethical code. They have no dynastic ambitions of family alliances or heritable property, no expectation of lifelong companionship. All believe that marriage is terminable at will. Most of them marry more than once. How do they distinguish this relationship from other forms of concubinage? That they do make a distinction is apparent from the gravity with which they discuss it. But Mr. Pohl gives no hint of its origin and character. Well, Pohl's novel, the one, Casanova's Chinese Restaurant, is set in 1936, not long after the time when Waugh was writing his early novels. And it occurs to the reader of that passage that no such mystery attends Waugh's treatment of similar behavior, nor is there any ambiguity as to how the reader is to understand the broken marriage of Guy Crouchback, the hero of Sword of Honor. The trilogy is a wartime book and draws on Waugh's own military experiences. Its theme is clear, and we are given Waugh's view of the modern world in the round. There are, of course, characters and scenes of masterful comedy. Apthorpe and his chemical toilet, Richie Hook, the mad commando leader, Jumbo, the benign professional military man having a good war, the ineffable Trimmer, hairdresser become war hero thanks to bogus publicity, the sinister Ludovic and his pensées. Guy's broken marriage enables Waugh to return one more time to the personal wound that never healed. His former wife, Guy's former wife, is promiscuous. Guy himself makes a rendezvous with her on the sound theological basis that they are still really married. But she is offended by this, evidently preferring the illicit. One could go on. But these are merely elements and leitmotifs in a work that explains more than any other Waugh's post-war gloom. Like Waugh himself, Guy Crouchback enters the Army in middle age, his soul stirred by the thought that he is engaged on a noble task, as was an ancestor who went off on a crusade. The conflict seems clearly one between good and evil, the Allies against fascists and communists. It is the defense of Christendom. The military plot, which is the main one, traces Guy's slow disillusionment as this initial interpretation of the meaning of World War II erodes. When Stalin and the USSR become allies of Britain and America, the war is seen as a struggle between two indistinguishable gangs of louts. As Waugh himself had, Guy ends in Yugoslavia, where the betrayal of the country to Tito proves the last straw. The sword of the title is one made at the king's command as a gift to the steel-hearted people of Stalingrad. It is put on display in London before being sent, and vast crowds gather to make obeisance. The final chapter is called Unconditional Surrender. Waugh's diaries have been published, as well as a huge number of letters, and there is as well the Gallagher collection mentioned earlier. Despite all this material, I won't call it Waugh material, he remains an elusive and enigmatic figure. His remarks about the post-conciliar church, cited above, are but the tip of an iceberg of disillusioned reaction, especially to the liturgical depredations that make worship penitential. Gallagher reprints some of this, but it would be nice if all Waugh's articles on the subject were brought out in a single volume, minus the all too often condescension towards such allegedly mugwump views that the otherwise conscientious Gallagher feels constrained to exhibit. There seems little doubt that comedy moved from a central place in the early novels to a more and more auxiliary role at the end. When Adlai Stevenson lost the second time to Dwight Eisenhower, he said that it hurt too much to laugh and he was too old to cry. Well, Waugh never cried, at least in public, but it seems inescapable that as he grew older in a world of leveling and illiteracy and liturgical razzmatazz, it increasingly hurt too much for him to laugh or to make others laugh. He does, however, have the laugh on his leftist enemies. Countercultural as he was, Waugh seems to be the most read novelist of his generation, his popularity surviving into these godless post-Christian times. But, after all, he died on Easter Sunday. Sir.
Yes.
Dr. Solomon.
How do you, there are a lot of critics of modernity in modern contemporary philosophy and literature. How do you separate out the serious critique from what was snobbery? I mean, the critics were doubtless too hard on him, and he played up to the critics about that. But he was a snob. And he...
No, he was English. Well, I'm repeating myself.
In the literature, in the novels, do you have a filter to separate out, as it were, the sort of elements of the critique and those kind of contingent features of...
I tried once to prove this hypothesis, that this persona characterized by snobbery and a lot of other things, was a work of fiction on his part, and that he deliberately created it. And in order to verify that, there is evidence in his letters of an enormous generosity and kindness. He was always giving people money. He particularly liked to give money to religious houses and so forth. There's a kind of simple devotion about him. You know that famous exchange when he was misbehaving and someone asked how he could be so awful and call himself a Catholic, and he said, "Can you imagine how much more awful I would be if I weren't?" Which again I think is part of their persona. I don't think that hypothesis would work out. One doesn't have to canonize Waugh in order to appreciate him as a novelist, and that he had personal flaws, unlike you and me, is probably a given. So I don't know that one has to apologize for that. As I say, if you read Black Mischief now, it's a very uneasy making, and there is racism that is just palpable. And you can say that was the times and so forth, but nonetheless there it is, and it's very. It couldn't have been published now, put it that way. It's reprinted all the time, but it could never have been published now. But it's an unfortunate carryover, I think, of the colonial thing. There's a little bit of mild anti-Semitism too, but it's very mild. So. Warts and all, that's what I would say. There's no way in which you can explain these things away. I tried, as I say. I once wrote a little piece called St. Evelyn Waugh, that with tongue-in-cheek.
Well, I'm still curious. How about, we're doing Waugh and Green both this week. Now, Green's not as funny as Waugh. Would you agree? And
there are wonderfully comic passages, but no, I mean I think the tone of the novel is always very. Oh, he wrote some Travels with My Aunt and things like that, which are meant to be comic and no doubt succeed. But those are the later novels, and it's kind of hard to think that he was working on all cylinders. Huh? But the Green that interests me is the Green of the Catholic novels, from Brighton Rock through The Heart of the Matter, The End of the Affair, and the Mexican novel, Labyrinthine Ways. I mean, these are massively good novels. I reread not too long ago The End of the Affair, and I had bought it when it came out, and hadn't read it for a while, and was just overwhelmed by it. The thing with Green, as well as Waugh, that struck me is the technical accomplishment of them as writers. I mean, when I wanted to write fiction, one of the things I did was to diagram and analyze Green. I could never write in that tone, obviously, or at that level, but still, as I suggested about Waugh, these are writers who can be studied by an aspiring writer with great profit. The technical skill is just amazing. Yeah. But I'm trying to think of a funny scene in Green. It's not easy, but they're there. Yeah. I mean, in the Catholic novels. Yeah.
Do you think, is there much of an understanding in these authors and why they write? Is there any focus on evangelization through their literature? Or do they ever talk about that?
Yeah. Well, Green, to start with him, was a writer who was always leery of being called a Catholic writer. And one of the reasons was that it's kind of hard to know what his status was. The burnt-out case just sounds like he's bidding goodbye to the faith that was present in those, what I'm calling the Catholic novels. But if you look at the quotation from Green that's on the poster, a beautiful poster announcing this week's series, that's a noteworthy thing. But Green was always afraid, I think, of being thought better than he was. Once he was at a meeting of some UNESCO thing, and he said, "Whenever I hear people talk of the brotherhood of man, I think of Cain and Abel." Huh? But Waugh, I think, his faith was clear. When you see him talking about what he was doing, in diaries and so forth, it's pretty clear he saw this not as direct evangelizing, but as conveying to his reader what he considered to be, and is, the true point of view on human action. But it had become quaint at his time, and he had to, most people, I think, many people, reacted to Brideshead Revisited as if it were, kind of archaeology of culture or something. Yeah? But for Waugh, it was a matter of standing in the great mainstream of Western civilization, Christendom. Yeah?
What kind of a relationship did Waugh and Green have? Because when we were thinking about the title, we were reading some of their interviews and Waugh's diaries, and it seemed that they made they commented about each other very highly, but then they also made some comments that seemed to sort of renounce the other's characters.
Well, Waugh's review of A Burnt-Out Case is clearly one where he's saying this is the portrait of someone who has lost his faith, and it's always been considered a fairly autobiographical novel by Green. But Green was kind of, how should I say, adolescent. Huh? I mean, he left his wife and children for reasons that are obscure, and had a whole series of affairs. But there was an American woman named Walton with whom he had just, The End of the Affair is supposedly based on this, with whom he had a long affair. She was married and had a lot of children, and he was her godfather. Huh? But he once brought her on a visit to Waugh's house, and when Waugh invited him, he said, "Do you mind if I bring my mistress?" Huh? Now, there's something strange about that way of talking about a woman, for one thing. It's kind of archaic, I suppose, but kind of contemptuous too. There is a wonderful memoir called Green on Capri by the Australian novelist whose name Solomon can't remember things anymore. Will occur to me, but she speaks of meeting Green on Capri, where he had a little house, and she and her husband used to go there, and she ran into him once in a restaurant in which he was with someone else, and he was trying to recall some line of poetry, and she had been doing a crossword puzzle, and she overheard it, and on the way out she gave him the line, and that was the beginning of their friendship. All of their conversations were about literature. Like Waugh, Green was enormously learned in the manner of a writer in English literature. He wrote on a slow boat to Africa during the war years, when he was a spy, a history of British drama. And apparently, he would have had to do most of it by memory. Now, Waugh reviewed that and puts it down a bit, but I must say, I've been amazed by the knowledge and perception with which he traces the beginning of drama from the medieval miracle plays and so on down to the very present. Yeah. Of course, Green himself became a dramatist, and wrote any number of very successful plays, something Waugh never did. What was the question? Were they, well, you know, there is, in earlier times, there was talk about Chesterton and Belloc, you know, and you would have thought that they lived cheek by jowl through all their lives. Actually, they saw one another very infrequently. And yet they were always associated, and they always considered themselves friends. And after Chesterton died, Waugh wrote just a very impressive short book on the achievement of Gilbert Chesterton, or the place of Gilbert Chesterton in English literature, which is a tremendous tribute to him. They were friends, but they weren't close. And I think that Waugh and Green were friends, but they were even less close. You know, they got together less often than Belloc and Chesterton did. But they certainly were aware of what the other one was doing. And I think they felt that they were, you know, engaged in the same effort. I think that's why Waugh was so appalled by the novel in which the main character, an architect, loses his faith and goes off to Africa, where else. It's a beautifully written book, though. It begins with a boat going up the river, and the captain is reading Descartes, or is it Pascal? But it's yeah. Any other questions I won't answer? Yeah.
Can one interpret David Lodge as being a more modern continuer of the tradition in some ways? I don't know, as Waugh-like.
Yeah.
I know Lodge was novels. I don't know.
Real light. I mean, Lodge is very accomplished, but he's very ambiguous with respect to his religion, isn't he? And Father Carr mentioned A.N. Wilson last night, who has been in and out of every church around, I think, recently. He's mad at the Pope for some reason, and he wrote a little diatribe about Pope John Paul II. But if you know his novels, A.N. Wilson, they're very well done. He doesn't write them much anymore. He's gone in for biography, written the life of Tolstoy and Belloc and C.S. Lewis. But he's one of those kind of religion is the flame and he's the moth. You know, he just he can't somehow be too comfortable with it. But Lodge is. You know, if I hadn't read things that he'd said outside the books, I might not be saying all these mean things about him. Yeah?
But Lodge surely is the closest of more recent novelists to writing the way Waugh wrote in the early Bright Young Things novels. Don't you think? I mean, Lodge's early novels have that same effervescent. And it just does seem that he was funnier when he was still a Catholic. Lodge was. I mean, if he's not a Catholic.
It's the only defense. It's got to be funny. Huh? But no, I think that a person with the interesting name of J. McInerny wrote a novel some years ago called Big City Bright Lights. And I thought, my gosh, this is Waugh redivivus. You know, it was very much like Vile Bodies and so forth. But it turns out that he's not Waugh redivivus. But nonetheless, I had that thought then. I just had it again. Had enough? Okay.
Before we thank Ralph, could I remind you that this series continues in a slightly different way this week. Tomorrow night, we don't listen to a talk. We return to one of these rooms to see Graham Greene's film, the film of his novel, The Third Man. And then on Thursday night, Tom Hibbs, who's Dean of the Honors College at Baylor University, and I think one of the most exciting film critics now writing, in addition to being a very accomplished philosopher, will be here to talk about Graham Greene and the film noir. So we invite you to come back for the film tomorrow night, and Thursday night, Tom Hibbs on Graham Greene as a film writer. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Ralph.